So, what was it like growing up autistic when you didn't even know you were autistic? Well, I'll tell you my experiences, and you can tell me if you experienced the same things or maybe something different, or maybe you had very opposite experiences than what I had. But the first thing I noticed about growing up autistic was it was kind of like having a permanent mental breakdown. Now, this began, I think, when I went to kindergarten. It became very obvious to me that, especially in first grade, that I was different. I couldn't fit in. I didn't socialize well with the other kids. And fortunately, there was no overt physical bullying. Now, most autistic kids, most SB kids, when they grow up in school, they sometimes they are intensely bullied. I mean, physically bullied, and people hurt them. But yeah, I understood that there was this dysfunction. I didn't know the word dysfunction. I just knew that I could not assimilate with the other kids, and that just remained. Now, the problem with that is this: you go through life, I'm saying starting at 5, 6 years old throughout your entire childhood and even into your adolescence. You go through your entire life living in stress and anxiety and fear, which ultimately I think turned or expressed itself as severe depression, particularly in later years of high school. So that was what it was like growing up autistic. Now, I got to say that, you know, uh, it could have been a lot worse. And if I could go back and do it again, would I do it? Probably not, because it was just that miserable. And that does impact, it does have an imprint on your life forever. I mean, even now, here I am pushing 7 years old, and those experiences that I had, and this I guess is true of everybody, but the experiences that I had in elementary school still stay with me. It's true of everybody, but sometimes those experiences are very positive for people. They are reaffirming. They have a place in life. They belong. And so they have that sense of belonging that stays with them forever. Not so with somebody with autism. At least that was my experience. Number two is I absolutely positively hated school. Why? Well, because number one, it was extremely boring. Number two, I didn't fit in. It was just kind of like a punishment when you didn't do anything wrong, and I had a very difficult time paying attention. So you'd go to school, bored to death, people didn't like you, but somehow, I don't know how this happened, somehow I managed to learn. How did that happen? I didn't pay attention. Well, apparently enough of it sunk in that I would pass grade to grade, and I guess I did okay. But you got to understand the schools are not made for artistic children. Autistic children. Typically, the education system is based on a three-tier structure. Tier number one is dumb kids. Tier number two are average kids. And tier number three is for smart kids. That's pretty much it. There's no tier for autistic kids or kids with any other, you know, neurological condition. None whatsoever. Now, that may have changed in recent years, but unfortunately, the people who are running the so-called education system are more, in my opinion, you can yell at me if you want, but they're more interested in indoctrinating kids than teaching them, and everything focuses on that laser point. But whatever, the point is, when I was in school, I did the absolute positive bare minimum that I had to do to get past. Sometimes I didn't even do that. They just passed me anyhow. And I asked a psychologist once why that was. I mean, why didn't they just hold me back? Because, I just sat there and didn't pay attention. And he said, well, the reason is because at the end of every school year, they test the students, and you obviously passed your test. You did well enough on your test that you qualified to be advanced to the next grade. So cool. So it's sunk in somehow, some way, even subconsciously. I don't know, but it did. Number three is one of the things I learned growing up in as autistic is there are no what I call ramps. The reason I say ramps is I mentioned this in a video the other day. If you're walking down a sidewalk, come to the end of the sidewalk, there's a little ramp on every sidewalk. Now, when I was growing up, there were no ramps on. You come to the curb, you step down, you stepped up. whichever way you're going. But there were no ramps. So if you're in a wheelchair, you're in trouble. But that's okay because there's so few people in wheelchairs, everybody thought, what's the point? So, and if you're in a wheelchair, there's probably somebody there to help you anyhow. And that's the way life is for basically any, what we would say, syndrome or disability or condition, whatever you want to call it. But that's the way it is. We don't accommodate these tiny minorities of people who have physical or neurological challenges. I was going to say difficulties, I'll say challenges. They're just not there. I mean, they don't accommodate autistic people, and they still don't. But growing up as a child, nobody really knew what autism was. And they still don't know what autism was. Some people do, some people don't. But I didn't know what it was. My parents, I don't think, knew what it was. The school, I don't think they knew what it was, or if they did, they didn't recognize it. So what happens? Well, when you're growing up autistic, you are misdiagnosed. I talked about this in another video. How do they diagnose you? Well, you're shy, you're aloof, you're out of touch. Sometimes you're just not too bright, or you're a loner. They have all these different ways of diagnosing you or explaining your behavior, or your odd behavior, or your lack of behavior, or your lack of involvement. And this goes on throughout your entire life, by the way. But as a kid, what happens is people give you these false diagnoses, and they become embedded in your thinking process. That becomes your identity. You think you are that person. And so you become that person. So there are no ramps for autistic children. Maybe there are some now. I don't know of any, but probably there are. I think some educators and parents are becoming wiser and more attuned to some of the challenges that kids face, one of those being autism, among many, many others. But that's how it is growing up, with autism. And I didn't even know I was autistic. I just knew there was something wrong. Didn't know what autism was. Number 4, growing up autistic, is that I was usually alone. Now, when I was a kid, I had a really, really, really good friend who lived a couple blocks from me, and we'd get together almost every day and would play and hang out, do whatever. But the problem is, because I was autistic, I think I didn't really understand that I needed to appreciate my friend more than I did. And I would, typical of people with Asperger syndrome, I would become easily offended. And sometimes my friend would say something or do something which was just benign, didn't mean anything, and I would be mad, and I'd stay away from him. Now, you may say that's kind of childish, right? Yeah, well, it was a child, so yeah, it makes sense. But it was also, I think, part of my autism because, this is my good friend. He didn't deserve to be treated like that, but I didn't know. Now, we had other boys my age who lived on my street, and I knew them. We got along. We didn't, they didn't bully me. We didn't fight with them, but I just wasn't part of them. I would hang out with them a little bit when I could, but it was kind of obvious that I wasn't part of this group. And part of that, I think, is because they all attended a Catholic school and I went to the public school. That may be part of it, but I think it's more likely is they sensed there was something in me that was just a little bit off. I was just kind of weird, so I got pushed out of the group. And that is typical of people with autism. We are either pushed out or we are left alone, one or the other, but somehow, some way, we always wind up being by ourselves. Number 5 is I grew up having very narrow interest. Well, I had this odd obsession, and you've heard me say this before, but I had this odd obsession with Southern gospel music. There were a couple groups that I really got into, and I was at that point in life, that point in history, when groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were really popular, and I just didn't like that music. Beach Boys, I kind of liked. They were a little bit ahead of my time, but I just got into Southern gospel music. I think it's because I like the harmony, and I could sing along with it. And I learned the parts of every song, and I played the records over and over and over again, to the point where I drove my family absolutely, positively crazy. I mean, that was, talk about a narrow interest, that was my interest. There were 2 or 3 groups that, I'd buy every record that my parents would bother to pay for, which they didn't. I don't think they wanted to do that because they didn't want to hear me playing those records all day long. But, I play the old records. Okay, let's buy them a new one. At least we can hear something different. in hindsight, I'm surprised they even let me do that. But I would spend my days listening to music. Then I would go out and ride my bicycle back and forth, back and forth. Didn't go anywhere in particular. Just ride rather up and down the alley. Good exercise, but what was happening is it's a type of stemming, I think. So children stem different ways, and my way of stemming was, at least at that moment, was to ride my bicycle, and my mind would wander. It's kind of like being in school, only without the restraints. So that part I liked. Now, when I got into high school, I really didn't have a whole lot of problem, I think, because, yeah, I'm jumping back to number 2 for just a moment, but I think because my school was so big that sometimes you don't have the peer pressures of a small school. So there were like 5,000 students in my school. It's more like a college campus. So you didn't have these little cliques. I'm sure they were there, but nobody noticed. It wasn't like we were divided between the cool kids and the uncool kids. There were just too many to have that division. You spend your whole 4 years, your high school career, and there are a lot of people you didn't even know. You never really met them. You just see them, and you might see one person, forget them, never see them again. That was a different environment than a typical high school. So yeah, I still didn't like it, but it was tolerable. There is one exception. When I turned, 15, 16 years old, they offered driver's ed in summer school. So I took summer school and took driver's ed, and while I was there, I figured, I may as well take another class or two. So there were very few kids there, but there was, it was summer school and everybody got along. There was no infighting. There were no cliques. Now, I can say that those, 2 months of summer school, that I really enjoyed that. I mean, that is the only time I can remember in school that I enjoyed. Okay, well, what about my adult life? We're not going to talk about that other than to say, once you launch into adult life, what I discovered was that I had no place. I went off to college. What is now Liberty University. And what I discovered was I would try to wedge myself into acceptance. What I found out is that doesn't work. I just had no place. I should not have been there. I was there for a couple of years, and finally I figured out, this isn't working. I'm not academically inclined. I've never learned how to study. People generally don't like me. I dress funny. I don't communicate well. I don't socialize well. People don't like me. I'm out of here. Then I thought about it and said, would it have been any better if, I think I went for 3 years, would it have been any better if I had gone in the workforce? And the answer is, well, no, because my place was no place. So, got home from school, went out, found a job, and what I discovered was couldn't keep a job, because that's very typical of autistic people, because you can do your job very well, but people don't want you around. And that is just kind of an extension of what it was like being a child. Nobody wants you around. That's kind of frustrating. So what do you do? Well, my opinion, you go your own direction, I'll go mine, but my opinion is what you do is you just accept yourself the way that you are. If I could change anything in my life, can't think of a thing I'd change. I mean, I had a good family, had good parents, had good siblings. Most of the time, sometimes they would play. This thing about being the youngest of the family, they say, well, you're spoiled. Not my family. I mean, they would play tricks on me. It was unbelievable. Some of the things I'd play hide and seek with your older brothers and sisters. They don't come look for you. I mean, I would sit in that laundry basket for what? For hours? I said, man, I'm really good at this. Nobody could find me. They weren't looking. But that's beside the point. I had a very good family life. All right. Let me know about you. How was your childhood? How did it affect you now? The way that you are, assuming that you're an adult, do you see the implications of what you endured and experienced as a child? Did you have a problem with bowling? Chances are you did if you're autistic. Let us know about it in the comments section. You see those 2 rectangles on the screen. Let's keep talking. If you want to, just click one of those rectangles rather, and we'll keep talking. But if not, see you next time.